Thanks a lot for inviting me to this conference, which has been very stimulating. I'm just taking notes all the time and writing references. And my slide here, first slide, takes 3 examples of things that I think are relevant for the kind of discussions we're having about what is outside the standard brains. I put Physiology, of course, where computation has to do with morphology. My beloved ants that do such amazing things, and I want to present them as what I call liquid brains and try to figure out how different they are from solid brains. And I also stole a picture from Twitter by Michael Levine, but well, he did with Midjourney, so I don't feel really guilty, about kind of artificial plant. And I want to use also this opportunity to make kind of a critical comment about the very important need we have of developing a new set of theories. And my lab has been working on evolutionary innovations for a long time. We are a bunch of physicists, biologists, and sometimes some computer scientists trying to figure out where evolution of complexity comes from and whether or not there are very general laws, whether or not we can use concepts from statistical physics like universality to refer to some key ideas that emerge in evolutionary theory. And here I put just kind of a collection of questions that are very relevant. Many of them, probably most of them, require evolutionary theory, evolutionary insight, and some of them have been there for a very long time. And I do think we are ripe now to answer some of them. And we have heard about major evolutionary transitions already, so I don't have to explain that. But the idea is to what extent we can actually address that problem from the theoretical perspective and say something about really fundamental principles. One of the kind of guiding principles of our research has to do with this dichotomy between contingency and convergence. Contingency is very well illustrated by Steve Gould's idea that he put so beautifully in his book, Wonderful Life. For those of you who don't know, Wonderful Life, the title comes from a movie by Frank Capra. I don't know here, but in Spain, it's every single Christmas you can see the movie. And it has this idea that if you were able to have an alternative life, be born again or never be born, so how things will be. And the movie kind of presents the idea that the main character, who is a very good person, yes, you have this angel, which is kind of an annoying character. He says, okay, let's try that. And the future is really bad, right? And totally different. And the perspective is, from Gould's idea is, if we were able to rerun the tape of evolution from the Cambrian explosion, for example, or maybe before, what kind of biosphere we will observe. And the idea is, Gould's point is it will be totally different, right? Like an alien biosphere. Instead, I think that people like me working in complex systems, we think that the biosphere will be different, but clearly familiar, right? That there are very strong constraints in what actually is possible. And a bit the point has been made by several people many years ago. One of them is one of my favorite scientists, Per Alberch. He was a Catalan scientist. Unfortunately, he died quite early, at 40-something, and he was proposing this idea that there are very strong fundamental constraints to development, which actually canalize the potential range of possibilities of evolution. And so not everything is possible, on the contrary. And he makes this point in this paper, not so well-known paper that I really recommend, beautifully written, The Logic of Monsters, where actually he makes the point that even if you look at teratology, so things that have no selective meaning for anything, right? If you make a kind of a taxonomy, you will observe that there's a huge order there. Not everything is possible again. And I recommend this book, Life Solution. Sounds like a self-help book, but this is a book of real science, right? Where Simon Conway-Morris puts together a lot of arguments based on convergence. So many things in evolution have been invented and reinvented many ways independently, and you observe essentially the same solutions. So what's the message of that? Probably that not everything is possible. So Some years ago, I organized this workshop at the Santa Fe Institute. The workshop title was Major Synthetic Evolutionary Transitions, right? What the hell is that? It's the kind of, I mean, I feel comfortable in this kind of meeting because that's the kind of meetings we organize at the Institute. The idea was the following. We can now go back in time and see how the major transitions occur. But we are in a quite good position nowadays to use the tools of statistical physics for searching of universals. We have synthetic biology as a way of interrogating biology and see if we can do things that maybe biology has not found out, right? We have evolutionary robotics, so we can actually use robots that evolve to see how language, for example, might emerge. And we have artificial life, right? Which is kind of a parallel universe of possibilities that in principle could give rise to totally different things. The interesting thing is that is not what happens. But even in the artificial life arena, things seem to recapitulate many times what is in biology. Here is just different examples of systems because the meeting was about origins of life, of cells, of multicellularity, of language. And here you have some natural, synthetic, and artificial examples. So, my personal contribution to that, this is a synthesis paper where I brought the idea that we can actually attack all these synthetic transitions from origins of genetic code, life, cells, et cetera, all the way up into synthetic minds, synthetic language, and even synthetic ecosystems. And that phase transitions is something that we use in physics as a very powerful tool, could underlie the whole idea of how do you get into new innovations, right? Because it's pretty much what we have. And then 2 years later, I mean, since in that meeting we had a lot of discussions about cognition, which was kind of the difficult part of the story also that we were trying to figure out how to get into explanations. So I organized this other working group with Stephanie Forrest and Melanie Moses on what we call liquid brains, solid brains, right? So what do you mean by liquid brains? And again, it's the beauty of the meetings at SFI. You know, I don't know. The point is, it might be relevant to try to make a synthesis of ideas. Let's bring together interesting people and see if we can actually come out with something. And this is a special issue that came out, philosophical transactions. And again, why liquid brains, solid brains? Well, what I mean by solid brain will be a brain like ours, right? Neurons are located in specific positions, and plasticity is in the interconnections, so all the fun is in the connectivity matrix. But what happens if you're an ant colony and you move around? Such a simple thing. If you move around, this conservation of connectivity as a spatial phenomenon, it's gone. It's not there anymore. Same for the immune system. So what is for example, one question is, what is the cognitive power of these systems? Is it going to be similar to a solid brain or maybe lower? Can we answer these questions? And there was a great debate. Michael Levine was there. And of course, I put here several examples which are kind of a repertoire of possibilities, including plants, right? Which could be kind of an extreme limit case in our system. And we came up with one of the papers about the statistical physics of liquid brains and trying to figure out how tools from statistical physics can actually allow us to classify the complexity classes, right? And kind of point into the direction that there's not everything is possible, but also that it might be some particular classes of organization that are possible, and that could be the targets of selection or whatever, right? So, questions, why brains? Why is not the biosphere just filled with microbes, right? Brains are costly, has been raised here. They have a cost. What kind of brains can we find out? Is the brains that we observe in this biosphere the only ones, or could be others that could be generated, right? What are the constraints? And some of that stuff has been emerging here about resources, et cetera, et cetera. And since I cannot talk about everything because I only have 20 minutes, right? Let me know when you have 3 left. I just cherry pick some of the things that we've been doing in my lab. I think you like the ideas because I try to bring some of the ways we find out to attack some of these problems, and I also bring some of the open questions that I think are still there, very important ones. So one point to start is about why brains and this moving hypothesis, right? The idea that in an uncertain environment where you have to search, right? Whatever you have to search, you need to have some kind of cognitive apparatus that allows you to do that. And that probably pushed a lot the emergence of brains, right? That's an idea of Linus. You can look at that in another side has been raised here, which I think is a fundamental principle of evolution of complexity, which is a brain is costly, but if it allows me to reduce the uncertainty of the environment, that can be a big payoff, right? So maybe this is one of the big messages we have to actually understand. One of my favorite papers on major transitions is this by Iva Jablonka and Mario Lam, The Evolution of Information, right? Because in Schatzmari and Miner-Smith paper, I mean, cognition was kind of set aside, but as they point out here, the emergence of neural agents, the emergence of cognitive agents, it's kind of a really, really turning point in evolution for many reasons, right? And for example, the idea that associative learning might have been one of the, probably a precondition for a complex mind. I think that is a pretty sensible thing. And so, if I want to map the space of possibilities, one legitimate question is, what is possible, what is not, and why there are some things I do not observe, right? For example, this is my drawings. Ants with a very large brain, we don't see that. Brains without this bilateral organization. Why not an amorphous brain, right? Where maybe all functionalities are kind of scattered around and self-organized. We don't observe that. We don't observe many things, right? It's a long list of things that we don't observe. And if you take art pieces, you will find out other things that we don't observe, like lions with, that can fly. So one of the things we have been promoting over the last years is this idea of the morphospace. It's not our idea. Morphospaces were introduced in paleobiology by David Raup, where he actually presented a way of putting order into the space, for example, of ammonites or shells using the axis with different geometric attributes. And to make the long story short, what he found is that when you put all the observed things that you find in the fossil record, you see that there are clusters of complexity there and voids. There are regions of these parameter pairs that seem to be forbidden. There's nothing there, right? The voids are important for many reasons. One is that maybe they represent parts of the non-possible biology because they're physical constraints, right? So it's forbidden for some fundamental problem. Or maybe evolution has not been unable to get there for whatever reason, right? So we did this one of the papers we did is a qualitative morphospace for organs in organoids. And the reason for doing that is that we've been working also as theoreticians, and for the last 12 years we had a wet lab also, to the terror of people in the building, which the theoreticians have a wet lab, synthetic biology stuff. And so we were very interested to explore this. And this is a space that is qualitative in the sense that the little spheres here mean examples that I put in a relative position, right? There's no real measures there because it's a really challenge. And let me see if this works. So I have an axis here, which is cognitive complexity, which means what's the complexity of the potential decision-making mechanisms that you have? What's the repertoire of possibilities? Physical state, liquid, solid, right? Nowadays, physicists working on active matter have very well definitions of what is liquid, what is solid for matter that is not just standard matter, it could be cells. And then the vertical axis, we have been here discussing about development, because development is a really fundamental thing. How relevant is a developmental process to actually build these systems? So see, I put here neural systems, let's say brains, right? High complexity, solid, development. I put here the immune system, right? Kind of the same, but you have a liquid system, right? It moves around, and it's interesting that models for the immune system networks is kind of neural network stuff. I could put here very simple things, printed organs, chemostats. Here I have insect colonies, which might sound like strange. This is not an organ, right? But in insect colonies, we do have development. We do have a colony structure. We do have a developmental processes that in many ways recapitulates that. It's not liquid, not solid, because you need the scaffold, right? The scaffold is created by a process of, we call stigmergy, so agents and the scaffold interact and evolve over time. But it's liquid also, because ants move around, right? And then we found out that there's a big space here, which essentially, it is a space of morphology is not explored. There's essentially nothing there, right? Which brings, of course, the question of why is that? So, so that's for the morphospaces, and I'm making a very short explanation of a lot of things we have done. So how do we model diverse cognitive systems, and in particular solid versus liquid? And again, can we say something about the complexity, the cognitive complexity that a liquid brain can achieve, right? So for me, when I say models of solid brains, it's the standard view of neural networks, okay? I put here Hopfield's model. Hopfield's model is beautiful in many ways, allows to actually bring associative memory in a lot of things, and works essentially by Hebbian rules, right? A very simple system. And the important message here is that I store my memories, the things that I have learned during the learning process, are the minima of a potential function, of an energy function, right? So it's kind of a physics description of the system. All right, I know that this can be a very highly dimensional space, that if I put billions of neurons, I can have access to many, many potential memories I can store. So what happened with liquid brains, right? What happened in things like an ant colony? This is for Essiton, is army ants. If you haven't seen them anytime, it's a great, amazing thing. You know, I was in Panama once, and I could see these small colonies, and I make the point because we'll see why it's relevant. Small colonies of huge ants with large eyes that could see you from the distance. And the other side was the army ants, which were moving around. You could hear like rain, and it was kind of 1 million or 2 million ants moving around. They are blind. They communicate by very simple chemical signals, but the whole behavior was quite amazing, like something kind, even like intentional, right? Like a huge system. So how can you do a model of this? Well, I will be totally unfair with the literature because it's a huge thing. But for example, and I make the long story short again, you can actually model ant colonies that perform a given set of tasks in terms of a neural network, where they interact with each other. You can define a matrix of interaction. So how likely is that I'm shifting my task? For example, I may be taking care of the nest, maybe just foraging, I may be doing whatever else. And we have measures done by Deborah Gordon in the field where you actually estimate these transition probabilities. Every yarn is a kind of a triple of spins. And we can actually show that it's very nice to work with that because you can actually show that experiments that you can do, like removing part of the ants or all the ants that are doing a given task, the whole colony reorganizes so to cover the needs. And then you can define with a Hamiltonian also. But the interesting thing is when you do the maths, what you observe in the end is that the Hamiltonian doesn't depend on the states of individual elements, right? It depends on the numbers of elements of ants doing particular tasks. So it depends on the populations. It's a very highly degenerate Hamiltonian. And what's the message of that? That the repertoire of possibilities is extremely small, right? You lose all the potential dimensions because individuals are lumped into populations. So my guess, liquid brains are going to be much less interesting. Of course, you can actually think, as I was saying before, in the potential things that are not there. I'm not a Trekkie, right? So, but anyways, it's useful for me. You know, this idea in science fiction that you have a mega colony of individuals with huge brains, right? And there's a queen, right? Which kind of controls the whole story. But it's a kind of a mind made of very big minds. A swarm, but that's not something we actually observe. Instead, and I want to make a point to some open question that I think is fundamental, right? When you deliver that into liquid systems with ant colonies, one of the big questions is, how do they perform the computations? But an observation that is very interesting, and is connected with what I was saying about the large ants that can see you and make decisions by their own, and the huge colonies where individuals are dumb, right? There seems to be a kind of a trade-off, that the more complex the colonies, the less complex the individuals. That's something that we kind of observe in multicellular systems also. And it's connected, this is a paper we did with one of my students, Jordi Delgado, trying to actually figure out how to explain this phenomenon. And it's connected with this idea of the complexity drain, a problem that is open, that is beautiful, and we need a theory for that, right? The idea that the more complex the collective, the less complex the individuals, right? All right. Another example I wanted to bring in relation with this idea of the space of the possible. There are things we do not observe. How much can we bring using synthetic biology and engineering? So can I engineer some solutions that are not there, that are not observed, right? We have done a lot of that. We engineered associative learning. We did a lot of stuff. And one of our interests for practical reasons is single cells, right? Single cells are interesting, as have been brought here by several people in beautiful talks, are an interesting case study because they do move. So the moving hypothesis might actually apply to them, right? I move in an environment that is uncertain, and I need to process information in relevant ways, right? Lacrimaria has been shown already, and some people are suggesting that you can actually look at the signaling networks that you observe inside these cells as information processing things like computers, right? An analogy that is not very correct. So we have used synthetic biology to actually interrogate this space of the possible, right? Particularly this empty space that I show you, we have found over the years that some things we can build there, right? And we start to figure out why selection is not able to get there. And synthetic biology has been able to bring a lot of things, from building periodic signals inside cells, to designing bacteria that can identify cancer cells. And one of the things we also contributed to was to actually show that it's possible to think in ways of bringing what we observe in collective intelligence into the synthetic biology arena. And ask yourself questions that we are trying to figure out, such as, for example, can we design bacteria that behave like ants and connect like ants and solve problems like ants, right? Something that is not in nature, but we think we can do, right? And it's also a space here of possibilities. So let me tell you something we did that was a very successful research to solve a problem that was there in the literature about the problem of designing synthetic circuits within cells, right? Usually the inspiration, the computer metaphor comes again and again and again, over and over, and it's not always the best one. But the problem we faced was the following, and I'll show you why the solution is interesting, is the following. When you design cells to do synthetic circuits, you are very limited by the number of, let's say, cables you can build in the system. By cables, I mean, I take a gene, I want this gene to send a signal, a transcription factor that affects that other gene in a way I want, right? In an electronic circuit, all the cables are the same, fine. But within cells, all have an identity, right? You cannot use the same signal for everyone. And the problem of that doesn't seem difficult, and this is an example of a circuit that we could actually build. It's a circuit that implements what's called a multiplexer, right? A circuit that essentially chooses between two channels, right? The details are not important, but you can actually write down by hand the circuit that will implement that. And it's fine, it's nice. The problem is, oftentimes in the lab when you try to do that, one of your cables sends a signal to somewhere else that you don't want, and what you want to implement, it doesn't work. More frustrating than anything else, sometimes the cells kill themselves, right? Which is, not what you expect. So this is the wiring problem, and we solve that by not taking inspiration in biology, not taking inspiration in engineering. we show that you can actually split the engineering that you want to do between different cells. The cells do not need to communicate, which is strange. So you build a consortium where essentially the output depends on which cell is showing what you want, right? Like a fluorescent protein. And by doing that, which again is not in the space of the observable, right? Isn't it possible, but not in the observable, you can actually show and solve the problem, right? So you can actually wire really complicated things, right? That was beautiful success, really. And it makes you think, is there a lot of room at the bottom that we can actually engineer, maybe beyond the standard biology? So I jump into plants, right? Again, if you look at our stuff, we've done a lot of things over the years. I jump into plants because it's a very important case study within our cognition space, right? In many ways, you could say that plants are solid, right? There's huge constraints into what cells can actually perform there for, just for morphogenetic reasons. If you look at the fundamental biology, plants are very different from animals, right? You have a modular architecture where you have multiple organs. Organs can be lost, and then you regrow them. It is an interesting example, in my opinion, of an idea that von Neumann brought, and I'll tell you what it was. Von Neumann brought this idea at the time when computers were kind of emergent, and they were failing all the time because they were based on vacuum tubes. The idea that, how do I build a computer that is reliable when the components are not reliable, right? Like the brain. So that he was trying to figure out how the brain works, because our neurons die, and we can even have a major loss, and we keep going. So it's not brains, but plants kind of, I think, that fit into this idea of working reliably, despite that your pieces, your modules, might be not reliable. You can lose them, right? So that has consequences. And one model I've been working on is part of, as I was saying, a whole research program that I think we need to push forward to solve many of the questions we are trying to solve. Is, okay, let's think in the following. That's a very minimal thing, right? I want to make a model of evolution of cognition where I could have two solutions, in a very simplified way, animals and plants, right? I put this diagram here. This is the finite state automaton that appeared in a paper for the fly trap, right? And I want to bring the attention that it's very nice, it's a computational system, but let's not forget that finite automata is the simplest computational metaphor you can build of something that does computations, right? A vending machine is a finite automaton, right? So I'll tell you what's the model about. Imagine, it's a very simplified model, imagine a space, right? In this space, which is a surface, a lattice if you want, you have two sources of energy that are coming. One is constant, right? Gets into every single point, that could be kind of light. And the other is a set of particles that fall and are also degraded. So you have a fluctuating number of particles of energy that are just moving around, right? And you start with a population of agents, right? Very simplified agents that can do two things. They can just stay here, light, okay? So I take light and I increase my mass. Or I look around, right? And if I find something, which could be something particularly tasty, right? I move there and I eat. But this has a cost. It's a cost of perception, it's a cost of movement, okay? So at the beginning, I invent these bizarre agents that could do the two things, right? Both. Every single agent in my model has a parameter, lambda, right? Which you see here, lambda, 1 minus lambda. This is for the amount of energy you can find from the particles. But again, remember, it's also a cost. And here is how much I can take from the light, which is constant, okay? And of course, if I don't move, if I'm sessile, I don't have to worry about the cost of moving. So what happens here? The result of the model, typical result is this one, right? I begin in the x-axis here. This is lambda. 0, in my case, means that I'm using only light, right? And 1 will be I'm just a predator. I look for particles, okay? So that's a typical scenario. I start everyone here, 1/2, and it's a branching phenomenon. And I want to bring the attention that those who became sessile and just don't move around, they don't spend energy, they just go into that extreme situation, not intermediate situations, but extreme. This is an example, I think, a way, very simplified model, to show, that's the paper I'm trying to finish. I wanted to finish before coming here, but I couldn't. To kind of point out in the direction is, if you don't have to move, right? Remember the moving hypothesis. You just stay. No need for cognition in terms of understanding the environment. I know that plants do stuff, right? But they use largely morphological changes, plus all the efforts against insect herbivores, right? That you don't need cognition, right? I want to reinforce this in a point I made in a paper, in a recent paper, a reply to a paper on plant sentience, that I do think that one of the reasons for being a skeptic about plants to be complex in terms of cognition, right? I know I'm here opposing to other people, right? But I think we need to put that here. Is that there are fundamental things like, even if we forget about the exact nature of neural networks, if you have interneurons or the equivalent of interneurons, you can process information beyond sensing and acting, right? If you do have that, you can do a lot, right? What is these implants? Not to mention loops and other things that are needed for complex cognitive tasks. So my point is, I might be wrong, of course, but we do need to develop models where cognition is made explicit, evolution is made explicit, and we can actually measure and search in the parameter space. And I'm almost there. In general, there's this interesting problem of defining the cognition space, right? Not only for organs and organoids, but in general for systems that perform complex cognitive tasks, right? And what can be said about complex cognition? So there's been very interesting papers in the literature, recent stuff, like this idea of convergent minds has been mentioned before, right? That we see beyond human brains when you look at all kinds of brains that you see there, solid brains, right? You see different paths that have been independent, leading into brain architectures that are different, but nevertheless provide the same kind of classes of behavior. So again, I'm going into the convergent picture, right? That even the kinds of minds that we can observe, it might be limited, right? But this is an open, it's a conjecture, right? It's not the proof of anything. So with my former student, Luis Seoane, if you search in Google, you find out there's a famous Luis Seoane who is a dead poet, so it's not him. And we explore this problem. It's an interesting moment now because we have all this, in part is hype, in part is interesting, stuff on ChatGPT and all the generation of neural networks which are questioning some ideas about the evolution of language, for example. How much relevant was language in relation with other parts of that make human minds interesting, right? And we wrote this paper, Evolution of Brains and Computers, the Roads Not Taken. In this paper, which I strongly recommend, what can I say? We provide several arguments about mainly two things. One is this: it is interesting to see that you have all this potential space of artificial minds, or if you want, artificial cognitive systems. In principle, they could be totally different from anything we know, right? But the reality is they use as basic units threshold polarized elements, right? So the formal neurons that McCulloch and Pitts introduced, which essentially is what they keep using, right? There's a special system that we use all the time. It doesn't seem to be an alternative for that. We use multi-layers, and you know probably the story of artificial intelligence, that people get inspired into vision and to this multi-layer structure of the cortex, but in principle we could use something else. Why is there no other architecture than that, right? Why we also find out this kind of basic principle again and again? Even the people who use evolutionary dynamics in artificial life, right? Why the same solutions kind of emerge again and again? And we conjecture that this is because this is what it is. That is, it's no multiple possibilities. It's very, very limited universe. And the second point is the artificial systems that are being built recently. That was before ChatGPT, so we kind of get worried that our paper might have just be useless now. But I think the point prevails. Our mind is special for many reasons. We are mental time travelers. I think that this is an extremely important component of the human mind, right? And there's no machine that has that. We can read the mind of the others. Nothing paranormal. It's more like our capacity of putting ourselves in the place of the other, which we say here might have been the origins, the preconditions for self-consciousness, right? If I understand the mind of the other, I'm probably going to start to ask myself about me. And there are a number of other properties that none of which are incorporated in artificial systems. And we made the hypothesis that this is going to make artificial intelligence as in real intelligence a kind of far away in the future. And couldn't be the other way. We also built a couple of morphospaces. And this one is a space where we try to put together artificial systems. In this case, the axis go again, computational complexity, but now you have autonomy, which is a tricky concept, right? And here, social interactions, right? Because, I mean, we also, humans are interesting because we are a social creature, and social interactions have been shaping our minds a lot. And also pointing from this diagram, where you can find some of your preferred features, right? Here's Martin's protocells will be here, right? Plants, you have no mercy, we put them in the low computational complexity, but interactions are important. Humans, I know it sounds like, hey, humans, we are on the top. Well, there are good reasons to put them there. And also, we point out that there's a big space between the artificial agents that have been created, from robotic systems to just software that performs functionalities, a chasm here that is not going to be covered unless we really go, again, into the real biology and what evolution brought to our minds. Just wanted to say that I've been very lucky to have my great students and postdocs working with me over the years on that. I would love to say that the book on liquid brains is already in Amazon, but it's not. I mean, I have a cover, right, which is something, but it's still a process of getting finished someday, right? And that would be all. Thank you.
Perfect timing. We have time for several questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was great, and hearing you talk a bit about sort of complexity and cognition, and I think this was already in what you said, but just to sort of ask you to say a bit more. How do you think about the relationship between attributing to a system that it's complex versus attributing to that system that it's cognitive? Where would you want to say do one rather than the other, in addition to sort of the case you made with plants? I just would love to hear more about that.
Okay, it's not trivial question, but let me say that complexity is something that we've been discussing all over the place about how do you define complexity. If you define complexity by, or a complex system by a system that has the attribute of having emergent phenomena, so that whatever is at the level of the system made of components, you cannot explain the system from the component properties, so it's an irreducible order. When we move into complex adaptive systems, which means essentially living systems, then I do think that the complexity you're talking about inevitably goes with cognitive complexity. The only thing I could add is that I do believe is about the discussion about, for example, for consciousness and things like that, there is a continuum. And I pretty much believe that is this continuum, that there will be, in a way, classes of complexity related to different types of cognition. Again, it's a conjecture.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm interested in this analogy between ant colonies and the brain.
Huh.
So how far can you take that? So for example, do ants in these colonies that you're talking about, do they have specialized responsibilities?
Okay, yeah. I mean, you mean that they have predefined tasks that they do all the time?
So in other words, so you're saying, well, you can take away some ants, but it would be like a stroke. I mean, you're reaching in and grabbing out a bunch of ants, and you don't know which ants those are. So and then they reorganize. So my question is, where does the intelligence of the ant colony come from the numbers? Does it come from the specialized nature, or is it, as I suspect, some combination of that? If it is some combination, then I'm wondering if you can apply Geordie's analysis to an ant colony and come up with the nodes in the ant colony, a special nodes that actually runs the colony, without which the colony wouldn't function. Have you ever tried to apply that analysis?
No, it's not going to happen.
Pardon?
It's not going to happen.
Oh,
I mean, I'll tell you why. We usually have this idea that ant colonies have this kind of caste. You know, that you have soldiers and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
The majority of ant colonies are monomorphic. So if you look at the ants, they all look equal, right?
Well, they look equal, but does that mean they are equal? I mean, neurons look kind of, you know.
Yeah. But I mean,
look equal, but
we know, but we can tag them and see, for example, if an ant today is doing nest maintenance, but maybe tomorrow is doing foraging, and the tasks just are very, very fluid. I mean, depending on the requirements, you can shift into something else.
Yeah.
But in the ant colonies that you have castes, so you have marked morphological differences, you do observe this kind of differentiation. Is a division of labor that is morphological, right? But I don't think that what Geordie was bringing is possible here. On the one hand, because again, they use gene regulatory networks. You could say that this is a liquid thing because they inside, but the connectivity matrix is predefined quite clear.
I'm sorry, what's defined?
The connectivity matrix. So this gene can interact with this and that, right? For transcription factors. So in that respect, I think the basic principle of performing computation is different. It's a liquid system. And as I was saying, I think that you do the right modeling. It's one of the predictions we have is that liquid systems will have cognitive capacities that are much less than solid brains, right? So it's probably the things like working memory and things like that are not going to be feasible in the systems.
Why would they have limited capacity? I mean, what's the fundamental reason why they would have limited capacities compared to solid brains?
Because they move around. And in solid brains, you have the connectivity matrix, which means that you have a very large space of connections where you can actually store things, right?
Yeah.
In the liquid system, you don't have that. Okay, unless
we need to get on. So if you could.
Okay.
Well, actually, I miscalculated the time, so we're actually pretty. We have to leave now, but
okay.
All right, maybe we can take this up later.
Yeah.
Because I'm really interested.
Okay. Anna, do you have a fast question?
Yeah, so I have a question about defining complexity. So suppose you define complexity in the sense like is the ability to stay alive for a very long period of time, right? So some of the systems that have been there way before humans, and they'll probably be there after humans' extinction, right? So I think whether this kind of like classification of like complex system in terms of like pyramidal is kind of like misleading. And again, taking like anthropocentric perspective, right? Putting the human on the top.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I understand the point that when it's been a whole literature that is trying to put humans on the top, and so as a consequence, saying the rest is not so interesting, right? I don't think we are in that place, but I do think, and I got pretty much convinced on that this set of attributes that evolution brought into this huge neocortex that exploded in 2 million years, where you put a complex recursive language. You have time, the perspective of time, which is, I think, is very, very important because it's a narrative. It's a lot of bringing curiosity and imagination, and plus other things like the way we do social interactions. The size of the contribution and how they combine, I do think is unique, right? So in that respect, I think that it's a separated, maybe unfortunately for the planet, but we made a special singular species. We can discuss that over coffee.
Okay, thank you very much, Ricard, for another stimulating talk.